This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Okay, we're switching now. We've talked about, in this process, we've talked about how do you identify problems, how do you negotiate solutions. Again, this is like a cocktail party, right? I'm just introducing you to these concepts. You're not really getting to know these concepts very well, but I'm trying to get you exposed to them. Now we're switching to questions of effectiveness. What are the effects? And I want to talk today about compliance, and then we'll talk about effectiveness as well. First of all, just to get some kind of terminology and stuff out on the board, one is just, I guess, talking about implementation, that when we talk about implementation, and the terminology is not great here. Implementation is just the passing of laws that, passing of domestic legislation that kind of puts into national law what's happening at the international level. Okay? So, I mean, you can also use it in a broader sense of anything that's used to make the treaty work. But often implementation is used in a legal sense of meaning just passing some sort of legal rule that implements the law in implements the treaty in national law. Why do you need that? Because international law doesn't have any operative power in most countries. Okay, any direct operational power. A country binds itself, the government binds itself, but in order to comply with that binding of itself, but also in order for people in the country to be regulated by it. So a corporation, so let's say a sulfur dioxide protocol that requires a 30% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions says the country agrees to meet that, but there's no requirements on anybody within the country directly. The treaty doesn't pass through directly and say that each corporation and each individual in the country has to do it reduced by 30%. Each country decides how it's going to implement those rules directly. Compliance, just the behavior on the ground. Does the behavior match the rules? Okay, are they over or under the speed limit? Are they over or under the 30% reduction from 1980 levels by 1993? Whatever the rules are. Monitoring, verification, transparency, basically getting information about the behavior or about the environment, the state of the environment. So monitoring, you can have monitoring of compliance sort of stuff. Did they reduce their emissions by 30%? You could also have monitoring about, let's say, what's happening to the acidification levels of lakes, right? Which would not be directly monitoring behavior, because perhaps lakes are in an area where, lakes vary by how well they can absorb acid, right? Sulfur dioxides, nitrogen oxides, etc. So you could have environmental monitoring or behavioral monitoring, and this is one of the important kind of questions in environmental stuff, in environmental treaties, and it's one that actually David Victor in his article, discusses at some length, which is the question of the relationship between compliance and effectiveness. Okay? If we're talking about the environmental effectiveness and compliance, you can imagine all four options, something that's both that has high compliance and high effectiveness, right? So you got good rules and everybody complies, the rules that if they were complied with perfectly would protect the environment and everybody complies with them perfectly. So that's high compliance, high effectiveness. You could have, again, you'll get used to these kind of graphs. So effectiveness and compliance. So good rules that are well enforced or well complied with, right? What would be a case of low effectiveness but high compliance? What would be a treaty that would have very high compliance but low effectiveness?
Just a shallow treaty.
Okay, like what, Diana?
Well, what was it? I can't remember what the example used. The sulfur dioxide emissions cutting by 30%, which most nations had already complied with on their own.
Okay, so that in perfect compliance, every country complies, but it was not very effective. Well, one is, there's sort of always another parameter, which is the compliance due to the treaty or not, and I want to get to that. But even one could be take the extreme example of that, which would be what? That is, a 30% reduction in sulfur emissions, no matter what, is probably a good thing, right? That it's effective. But what would be something else? Like think about what if we had a treaty that said we only reduce, that we limit ourselves to only a 50% reduction in, we have no more than a 50% increase in our CO2 emissions over the next 50 years, right? We'd have very high compliance with that, but no effect on the environment, right? So you can have rules that are basically this is the case of just a meaningless treaty. Doesn't require any behavioral change, right? So you get high compliance since it doesn't require anything, but because it doesn't require anything, it's very ineffective in terms of environmental protection. What about low compliance but high effectiveness? Risa, any ideas?
Things like cut all CO2 emissions now.
Okay. Okay, so that you could imagine, and why would that, okay, so I get why that would be low compliance, right? Why would it be high effectiveness? Or how could it, what would be a story you could tell about where that treaty would be high effectiveness? And maybe even higher effectiveness than the one we have, which is a 5% reduction. Why might it be higher?
Because if all the countries complied, there would be no more CO2 emissions.
Right, but why on the ground do you think it would be even more effective than a treaty that only required a 5% reduction? In real life, why might you prefer that treaty than another one?
Because people would be forced to find long-term alternatives.
Okay, forced to? You got something that nobody believes is achievable. Why would they be forced to do it? Remember, we don't have some government that's going to come in and shut everybody down. Can you tell a story that would make sense for why that might be very effective even though there's not compliance? What's the value of something like shut it down?
You've got other people like big business looking into alternatives.
Okay, one is they're scared that you might actually try to make it work sometime, and so they better get on it. So they might look into alternatives. That's one story. Okay.
Well, people just might make some attempt, and that little attempt might be larger than the smaller treaty. Right.
So you might imagine that they don't really think it's going to happen, but they think we should really do this. They take the problem seriously, right? This is human rights right here, right? Nobody's complying with any of the human rights treaties in the world. But you could argue that it's pretty effective, that they're not compliant. The rules say everybody should have clothing, food, shelter, no discrimination against women, no discrimination against people, based on race, all these things. But there's some progress being made relative to what would have happened otherwise. And some good things are happening because of it. Not good enough, but it's a hell of a lot better than whatever we would say in a compliance sense. Nobody's even close to providing what's required by human rights laws, okay? But the fact that there's this kind of, it's I forget who it is, but if a person's reach not exceed their grasp, then what's the heaven for, right? The fact that you set up some good goals can be very motivating, even if you never achieve them, right? And then what would be, low effectiveness and low compliance is all the treaties in the world here, right? They didn't try to achieve much, and they didn't even achieve that, right? That's kind of our worst pessimistic view of international law, is that all they do is sign up to do nothing at all, and they don't even do that, That's kind of the worst case scenario. Okay, so enforcement, and this is tricky because, and I'll get into this in a second, but when you think about enforcement, what do you think about? When I say enforcement, what comes to mind?
Sanctions.
Sanctions. Punish people. Anything else come to mind?
Police.
Police. People who are out there monitoring so that you can impose sanctions, right? Okay, other things, enforcement.
Kind of judicial body.
Somebody who's deciding whether the police who saw me speeding, whether I complied or not based on what the rule was, comparing my behavior to the rule, and then sanctioning me if I was beyond the rule, right? But that's enforcement. But I think one of the challenging things, and that's kind of what I want you to walk away from today's talk with, is the sense that enforcement is exactly what you're saying, but that I'd like to expand some notion of what we might call, what Abe and Tony Shays call compliance management. That is, the goal is not enforcement, right? What's the biggest goal in an environmental treaty?
To get what the treaty wants, to have the goal that the treaty sets up and end up happening.
Okay, to have the goal, the treaty end up happening, right? We don't want to displace the goal. We don't want to say our measure of success is how many people get punished, right? We want to see how much behavior change do we induce. That's the goal, right? That's the important point of the whole thing. So, what you want to do is make compliance more likely. And I'm not even compliance. And David Victor is big over on this. And others as well. Compliance is sort of irrelevant. All we want is behavior change, right? So if the Soviet Union reduces its emissions by 50% of sulfur dioxide, that's compliance, but pretty meaningless compliance, right? And if Hungary reduces its emissions only by 10%, that's not compliance. But that may be very important because that was really induced by the Lurtap Treaty, right? If we can identify what it was that led Hungary to make those reductions, that could be really important. And then effectiveness, and we've already talked about. Counterfactuals and goal achievement, right, as two different flavors of effectiveness, right? Did it achieve the goals, and was it different than before? Was it different, than it would have been without the treaty? Okay, so that's sort of just some background. So why do nations comply? Say what, Carter?
Are you asking for a different reason?
Yeah, just start. I mean, when you think about, we observe some country complying with some treaty. What are our explanations for why that would happen? Why do we expect nations would comply with treaties?
Pressure from the hegemon, that'd be one option.
Okay, so one is pressure from a hegemon, right? Okay, again, so that actually suggests that the counterfactual value of that treaty is probably not great, right? That is, the hegemon doesn't like what they're doing. They would have pressured them with the treaty or without. The treaty is just the vehicle they use to do so. What are some other reasons why we might expect? So this explains why weak countries, powerless countries comply, right? What about, why might we expect strong countries to comply?
Public opinion.
What?
Public opinion.
Okay, so some domestic politics. Does that also mean that there's no effect of the treaty? Or tell me a story in which domestic politics means there's no real effect of the treaty and one in which there is.
Well,
notice, I mean, one important point here is this is process. Now we're starting to talk about a causal narrative of how a treaty might work or might not. Right? It's either a causal narrative or it's a rival hypothesis to the treaty. So what's the rival hypothesis version? That it's public opinion, not the treaty.
That there's some sort of groundswell of movement towards, I don't know, even before like the whaling regime, before the convention or the moratorium or any of the conventions came along, that some environmentalists sort of drove a movement among the people that put pressure on the government to stop whaling anyways.
Okay.
That they started before or simultaneously with the treaty.
Okay.
Or maybe
Fair enough. Card?
or the treaty was there and then only when public opinion started coming in, or people drew in public opinion.
Okay, so that would be another one. And I'll get back to that, Sarah.
I was going to say, if it's something just within the country, like the United States is polluting itself, but say like the United States is like a human rights treaty, so if they join, then like other countries that are violating human rights will join. It's sort of like if it's more connected to an international thing, it'd be more due to the treaty than if it was just a domestic issue.
So one example, using the United States would be acid rain, right? That Americans are regulating acid rain and reducing acid rain emissions, not because of the agreement with Canada about acid rain, but because people up in New England say, we wish those midi smokestacks would stop killing off all our lakes because we can't fish, we can't swim, all our lakes are dying. And there's domestic regulation, domestic public pressure to do it because we're fouling our own nest. We are also fouling other people's nests, right? Canada's nest, but we're fouling our own nest, and we want to clean. And there's domestic public pressure to clean that up. Okay, so you might see some, compliance just because it's in their own self-interest. Okay, other aspects of why nations comply. I mean, where do treaties come from? Rinda, do you have a point?
Well, I was going to say maybe it has a long-term benefit for the economy.
Okay, so there might be some long-term benefits. But notice, and then a last thing is think about where treaties come from. When countries sign a treaty, why do they sign? Because they think it's not in their interest? No, they think it's in their interest. So there might be there might certainly would be cases, and whose interest is it in? The weak states that Kari was talking about before? Or strong states? Whose interests do you think are reflected in the treaty? Strong states, right? I mean, this is called IR here, right? The basic IR is the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. If we negotiate, I mean, kind of Exhibit A, look at who's on the Security Council in the UN. Right? The people who were powerful at the end of World War II. I mean, that's also an indication of the stickiness of institutions, right? Those are not the most powerful states in the world now, right? And so that's an important element of thinking about how institutions reflect power, but power shifts more quickly than institutions do. Institutions tend to be inertial, right? So, but it certainly reflects power, right? Look at voting rules in the IMF and the World Bank. And then just look at all the human rights laws. What do those look like? Well, they look pretty much like the human rights, as defined by the American Bill of Rights, right, in the Constitution. And you look at almost every treaty, human rights treaty that's been signed, it is almost always in response to some big public pressure within the U.S., right? And so what you might see is that for, let's say, a bunch of domestic politics reasons, right? A country decides that they have to do something. And particularly in the environmental sphere, why would one expect the treaty to reflect the interests of the powerful? Because you have some process like this. You have some green enviros here, right? Who put pressure on government of a powerful state. Who says, let's regulate industry, right? Who puts pressure back to not regulate, but that fails. So what they do is say, put pressure on regulate internationally, right? And this forms a treaty. Why? Why all of a sudden do this industry switch to regulate internationally? Why did you see, why in most treaty environmental scenarios do you see industry in the United States perhaps and in Germany and France, big powerful states, why do they start supporting international environmental regulation?
Well, they want to make sure that if they're following the rules and everyone else does too, so they don't get caught behind.
Okay, did everybody hear that? That basically it's if you're going to unlevel the playing field, right? By regulating us, then re-level it by regulating everybody else, right? So this is where you get Elizabeth Desambre has just come out with a nice book. I forget the exact name of it. But the basic argument is Baptists and bootleggers. Okay? During Prohibition, there was a nice coalition of Baptists and bootleggers. Why? The Baptists didn't like drinking. The bootleggers liked not having anybody officially selling it so that they could make more money in the black market, right? So you can imagine that the Medellin cartel is quite happy when you have, these anti-drug campaigns, right? So that there's this process of industry desiring regulation because it relevels the playing field, right? Okay, so this is something like a self-interest argument, right? It just says the weak do it, the strong countries do it because the treaty reflects their interests. In other words, they don't only negotiate and sign and ratify things that reflects their interests, narrowly defined. Okay? So the strong do it because the treaty reflects their interests. The weak do it because the strong tell them they're going to do it, right? And these kind of domestic politics and long-term benefits are part of why those strong states see it as in their interests, right? A sort of a larger kind of a broader sense of self-interest might be to say it's not merely that it's in their short-term interest, but also in a complex environment where you have a lot of uncertainty out there in the world. What does a treaty do? It sets up a set of rules that says, it sets up a focal point, right? It says most countries are going to do that. If you're trying to figure out what to do in the world, one piece of information is what's required. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but in a kind of blank world in which you don't know how to distinguish different choices you can make, having a set of rules is something you end up focusing on, and it frames it in a way of either you comply with it or not. But there's some sense of which, if it's a really uncertain and complex world, having some set of rules is better than no set of rules at all, right? So think about in most marine pollution cases, what you have is a complex system in which there's a bunch of ships out there, and they have to go in and out of various ports around the world, right? Moving various goods and services around the world. And so you have these shipping companies that want to know how to build their ships, how to operate their ships. And in the absence of regulations, they'll just do it however they want, right? But in the presence of regulation, it says, I've got to make some choices here about whether to go along this path through the ocean or along some other path, or to build my ship this way or some other way. And there's a bunch of a complex sort of set of social institutions that tend to say, well, the place to start is what's required. And so a ship, if I want to go buy a ship, I have to buy it from a shipbuilder. The shipbuilder says, how should I build my ship? They don't just build it however they think is technically best. They also say, besides technically best, what's required by international law? They get that in turn from sort of classification societies and insurers who say, I want ships built this way. And those guys in turn say, well, let's at least make a minimum requirement that it complies with international law, so that you have some law laid down by the International Maritime Organization. Lloyd's of London, who insures boats, says, hey, you want to be insured by us, you have to first at least comply with the rules about how you build your ship. The shipbuilders say, we don't want to be building ships that nobody wants to buy, so they look at Lloyd's of London's rules. They build ships certain ways. Once they build those ships those certain ways, there isn't really any way for the shipbuilder, for me wanting to buy a ship that doesn't meet requirements. I can't go out and buy a ship that doesn't have the right equipment on board. Just like when you go down to buy a new car, you go down and say, let's find which one has the best gasoline mileage. And if you can take the catalytic converter, if I can buy a car without a catalytic converter on it, let's do that. Why do you all have catalytic converters on your car? You don't even know what they are. No, why does everybody have catalytic converters on the car? They're required equipment. You can't buy a car that doesn't have them. right? And it's not so much that they're required, it's just that if you're out in Detroit, you're going to be making cars that comply with national law because you want to sell your cars. And then the people buying cars don't have a choice about whether to buy them with catalytic converters or not, right? I mean, you can imagine a regulation that says all cars by the year 2020 have to be electric. And at that point, explaining my compliance with why I have an electric car in 2025 has nothing to do with it with incentives. I don't even have an option of buying a car that's not electric because that's all the cars that will be produced. Okay, so we have some sort of, there's sort of self-interest sort of more broadly defined. And notice that there's also this kind of standard operating procedures. Those of you who know organizational theory, that once an organization gets set up, it looks to reduce uncertainty and to kind of have just processes that happen, right? They don't have to be good processes as long as people know how they work, right? I mean, any of you who have been to the Department of Motor Vehicles know that they don't have a good process for getting you through, but they have a process that is consistent and works every time, right? It may take hours, but you'll get through it. So there's this kind of, you don't want to reevaluate what's the best choice. Sometimes you want to just say, I don't want to have to think about what kind of ship to buy. I just want to buy all my ships the same. Even if it's a little less efficient, it reduces your decision cost of deciding what kind of ship to buy each time. And treaties can do the same thing. They can just say, you don't have to decide how to address a production process in order to determine how much mercury to produce as a byproduct. You just follow the rules that say you can't have any mercury byproduct. Okay, so it reduces your uncertainty. But I think the more interesting thing, so this is sort of independent self-interest, narrowly defined or broadly defined. But another important part is interdependent self-interest. And so why do nations comply from a point of view of interdependent self-interest? Okay? I mean, one is coordination games. Okay, these notions. I mean, does anybody know what a coordination game is? Okay, these are problems where you say there's several different ways we could behave collectively. It's kind of like it's a game in the sense that the prisoner's dilemma is a game, right, or a tragedy of the commons is a game. But here's a game in which nations have to decide to comply. And they don't just make their own decision about whether to comply or not, based on the world they face. But what's the best decision is based on what everybody else does. Okay? So, for example, and there aren't as many environmental examples. Well, actually, let's take the. I'll use a simple example first, a non-environmental example, and bring it back to an environmental example. Think about the rule that. Or the problem in which you have countries, various planes flying around the world these days, right? You've got pilots in all those planes. And all those pilots come from different countries. And all those pilots' native tongue is different, right? Their first language is different. What do you need a rule for? What do you need an international rule for? What?
Language.
Language. So you have to have everybody speak one language so that when they fly into New York or fly into Johannesburg or whatever, they can talk to the control tower, right? And so when you fly from the U.S. to Paris or from New York to Paris or Paris to New York, you have to make sure that at both ends of that line, you can talk to the control tower so you can land safely. There, the question is everybody would prefer it was their home language, right? And it was if everybody in Latin America would prefer that it was Spanish, right? That the language, that they didn't have to retrain their pilots to learn English to fly to the U.S. All the Chinese would prefer that it was Chinese, right? And so everybody would prefer their own language, their own native tongue be the main language, but everybody even more prefers that there's not some complexity of voices coming in, so that all their air traffic controllers have to learn every other language. Right? This makes the kind of reduce it. One equilibrium is air traffic controllers have to learn all 532 languages there are in the world. That's one option. The other is everybody just speaks whatever language and you just hope nobody lands unsafely, right? And the third option is pick one language that everybody has to kind of coordinate to. And that was chosen, not surprisingly, as what language? French, right? So it's English, and everybody learns English. The French are not happy with this, right? The French would especially given how they would respond if we tried to speak French, they would be even less happy with that, so they prefer that we at least speak English properly. But everybody coordinates on that, and once you have that, is there any reason to cheat? Any reason? Do we expect high non-compliance rates with this rule? You have a lot of French pilots flying into JFK saying, "Je ne parle pas anglais"? No? Doesn't happen. Why? Why didn't it happen? Megan?
Because they don't want their planes crashing.
Say what?
Because they don't want to crash.
Who they?
The pilot.
The pilot.
It's in the pilot's self-interest to learn English if he wants to land his plane.
Very good. So notice that the costs of defection, right, the costs of non-compliance are high to the non-complier. How is that different than a tragedy of the commons?
The cost to the non-complier is negligent. The cost to society is high.
Right, exactly. So in this case, the cost to society of a plane crashing may be higher than the cost to the pilot and the passengers, the cattle in the back, right, to the passengers. So there's a cost to all of them. And the cost of society is even higher because we have to repair the runway and all the other people on the ground who get killed and whatever, right? So the costs are higher, but they're high enough to the people involved in the decision making that they don't do it. Whereas in the other case, in the tragedy of the commons that we went through, that's a coordination game where the costs the social costs are a lot higher, and the private costs are actually negligible or even positive, right? That there's private benefits to cheating. Okay, that's what drives the tragedy of the commons problem.
Is that collaboration, or?
That's collaboration. There's an article by Art Stein down at UCLA back in like '83 in Krasner's Regimes volume, where he lays out coordination and collaboration. The words are so much alike that it took me like 5 years to be able to sort out which was which. And if you just picked two different names that worked better, it would have been better. But that's kind of how it's become known. Okay, so coordination is this notion of the kind of language, right, or for ships, right, when you have big tankers out on the ocean. You have to have rules of the road, right? Drive on the left, drive on the right. Or, for example, think of where they had to have a coordination game, very important coordination game, in the Channel. What was it?
Which side to drive on?
No, they don't know which side to drive on. What's the coordination problem? Driving through the Channel.
Where to switch?
Where to switch, right? You don't want some people switching into the Channel at the British end and some people switching into this Channel at the French end. You got to know exactly at which point do you switch from left-hand side to right-hand side or vice versa, right? So we know which side everybody drives on, and you've got to figure out where at exactly what point in the Channel do you switch sides and start driving on the French side or the British side of the road, right? In environmental affairs, something like this would be in shipbuilding, right? That what would really be a drag is if you're you want to build ships and you want to operate tankers, and every country in the world is making domestic legislation that says your tanker has to look like this, right? And all of those are different. So you really like international regulation as a way to say, hey, if you're going to regulate me in a way that once I meet that regulation, I can get into any country I want. Right? Because I don't want to have to build ships that can get into Spain and then build different ships to get into the US and different ships that can get into France, right? Because each country is setting its own regulations. I want some coordinated set of rules that I can follow, okay? I'd prefer no rules at all and I just build my ships however works best for me economically. But if you're going to regulate me, do it collectively. If I'm a corporation that's an international corporation, that's a coordination game, right? So solving the environmental problem is not a coordination game, but how you solve it is, okay? Okay, so if those are sort of why nations comply, why do nations violate? Okay, and I'm just going to run through these quickly because I want to move along. But first is, and these are, I think, an important point that we also often don't see, is that there's ways in which why we violate is different than why we comply. And it helps draw out things about how we make violators comply. Go to how do we fix things. So first is just the opposite, is just preference. Or what I'll call intention. that sometimes people violate intentionally. In the tragedy of the commons, what's the assumption? That once you say only put on 20, what was our assumption about the other actors, who cheated? What was our assumption? That they did it intentionally, right? Wasn't an accident they put on too many. They had a strong preference for putting on too many, and they did, right? So the first explanation of why nations violate is preference. And it's not always that there's this free riding problem, but it can be just, if we think about why some nations are likely to violate certain environmental rules, it may well be just there's not even agreement that there's a problem, right? A lot of countries say, where's the problem here, right? There's not a, if you're in a middle latitude state, you're not worried about ozone loss. It affects Australia and South Africa, so who cares? I don't think there's a problem for me. It doesn't hurt me, so I don't agree there's a problem. So my preference is just to go about my business, right? Or if we think of developing countries in a lot of environmental agreements, they're saying, you're making me worry about a problem that's 100 years out. I got to worry about schistosomiasis and malaria and dysentery and all these things today. Different preferences. I agree it's a problem. It's just not a problem I want to spend any money worrying about. I want to spend money worrying about some other things. Okay, and I'm going to violate that treaty because it doesn't meet my needs, right? And so you might have countries, going back to this kind of pressure from hegemon, you might have strong states that sign an agreement because it looks good for PR, but then violate it because it's not in their interest to do so. Interests may change, right, over time. So there's preferences and intention. But a second is, an important one, is incapacity. You just might not be able to do it. In the oil pollution case, one of the first rules out there was that you couldn't let your ship dump more than 100 parts per million of oil. In the oil-water mixture, the oil couldn't be more than 100 parts per million. And there were no devices that could measure how much parts per million there was in oil and water. So they set up a rule that nobody can comply with because the technology wasn't there, right? So you can sometimes have rules where it's just technically incapable. But if you think kind of more likely are cases where you have the administrative or financial incapacity to do something. And financial incapacity certainly can go back into this kind of this difference in preferences. If India says it doesn't have the money to comply with the Montreal Protocol, is that it really doesn't have the money? Or just it doesn't want to take money away from its nuclear weapons program to use it? It's hard to tell the difference between those two. But there may be cases like in administrative, certainly at the extreme part of why we want to fund these countries for compliance is because we believe that they shouldn't have to make those choices and that they're incapable of achieving all their other goals and also reducing their pollution problem. But the other is administrative. Risa, did you have a question on this?
Yeah. Question.
Sure.
So if for like the example you said about it's technologically impossible to measure parts per million, then why do they go ahead and sign treaties like that, or why do they actually have that as a rule if everyone knows that it can't happen?
What's a good kind of if to the extent that Risa's question is a rhetorical one, we just say states are stupid. But what would be a good reason to do that? Why would you want to set a rule that said we want to measure 100 parts per million? Megan?
Because maybe if there's a ruler, someone will figure out how to do it.
You got it. Kind of technology push, right? You kind of make this as a requirement, and you hope that some great entrepreneur goes out and says, wow, there's a market out there for something that can measure 100 parts per million, and we can make a buck selling it, right? And it will develop, right? So you kind of challenge yourself to do more. You do things that you are not currently capable of in order to get yourself to be capable of it, right? All of us, if you're a sports person, a runner or something, you set a goal that you can't achieve currently in order that you could it motivates you to achieve it at some future point. Kari and then Megan.
Is that also like in the whaling case? It seems like they set is it considered better to set some sort of standard, to have like some standard out there than to have no standard at all? Like in the whaling case, it seems like they used the blue whale unit. Yeah, that all scientists thought was pretty much
Crazy.
Useless, but then it seemed like they just sort of thought it was good to have some sort of standard out there.
See, this is a question I think is really important that we don't know the answer to, but is a question of which is better. If you have three options, one is a completely realistic rule, which goes back to the graph earlier, super high compliance and no effectiveness, right? It doesn't, you just sign up to do what you're going to do anyway, so you'll have really high compliance. The second is one that's kind of a realistic challenge, and the third is a completely unrealistic challenge. And if you want a realistic challenge versus an unrealistic one, which do work better? I mean, think for yourself. There's some ways. I mean, I was like in a cooking class a couple months ago, and this local organic cook was talking about, and she was saying, don't try to force yourself to cook completely organic, because you won't do it, because you can't do it, because you can't buy everything organic around here, right? You can't buy organic herbs, let's say, right? And so don't try to go completely organic, because you'll try to do it, you'll fail, and then you'll give up completely on the goal, right? And you'll just go back to eating, stuff out of a frozen food case, right? So instead, what you want to do is set a realistic goal. But it's not clear to me that that's always the case, right? That in the human rights case, I don't know if we want to say, yeah, you can only put 20% of your people in prison, of your political dissidents in prison every year. There's something to be said for a bright line that we fall short of, but that's a bright line, right? Look at most religious rules are of that nature. They don't say, only have 3 affairs during your married life, and beyond that it's not okay. No, you set a rule, which, yes, most people only have 3 affairs and they don't have more, but the goal is to have some sort of bright line that you say people strive for, and you admit that it's kind of tolerant to violation, right? You have a violation tolerance system. Okay, and so I think those are important questions. And probably what the answer is you want bright lines in some cases and realistic lines in others, but it would be nice to know, one, what cases, and then how they work differently, because we do know there's a sense of, sometimes you say, we don't tend to respond to the, don't have an adulterous affair by saying, that's just too hard a goal to achieve. We sort of say, well, try to achieve it, and then if you have an affair, well, you kind of work that out, right? But whereas there's other ones where we say, no, that is just so hard and out of the way that I'm not even going to strive for it. I'm just going to give up all hope of achieving that goal. And I think kind of thinking about that dynamic process by which one works and one doesn't, what that is, that would be cool. Because that's one of the things that I'd like to see, somebody take a crack at in this kind of thing. And for me, it's important. I mean, the real case is the whaling case. Should we have a rule that says no whaling, knowing that some states will whale under scientific permits and everything else? Or should we have a rule that says, no, you can whale a little bit, but at a limited level? If all we care about is how many whales get killed every year, which of those two is better? And it's not at all clear to me that we know what the answer is to that. That if all you care about is total number of whales killed over a long time, which of those would work better? Or, a kind of sort of moralistic, sort of religious type rule that says you can't kill any whales, knowing that we're going to do that, but over the long haul, maybe we'll get there, right? Being able to point to that's wrong is a powerful statement, right? It's a powerful motivator. If everybody in the world is saying you can keep doing it, but it is wrong, rather than you can keep doing it and it's okay, but only at a limited level. Different kind of social processes that lead states to change their behavior, and you want to think about which of those is more powerful. And I don't think we know. We certainly don't know it, and in some, there haven't been a lot of studies that have sort of said, here's the answer to that one. One works better. So there's incapacity issues, and I think those are important. I mean, administrative ones, just think about something like what it's like for Brazil. I mean, to the extent that you're American, you're pretty used to this notion that all rules get passed down and you know what they are, you know how to comply with them. If you're an illiterate Brazilian peasant, right, and then think about the Brazilian administrator who has to try to get some rule passed that says don't cut down the rainforest. How do you do it? There's hundreds of thousands of Brazilian peasants in the middle of the rainforest. You can't get to them. If you got to them, they can't read. How do you tell them there's a rule that you can't cut down the rainforest? Just the technical incapacity problem, the administrative incapacity problems are huge. You know, how do you go about regulating people? In America, you've got a literate population that's very kind of networked in a variety of ways. You know, most of us read newspapers of some sort or other. There's all kinds of ways of getting information to the people you want to regulate. In a lot of systems there aren't. A lot of countries, you know, the population, there's no interaction between the government and the population at all, you know, or significant fractions. Big administrative problems, obstacles. So incapacity. Third one is inadvertence. And I think this is one that, especially since we now have a lot of pressure for kind of economic approaches to problems, market-based incentives. Think about the US trying to comply with a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions by the year 2010, right? So we call up our favorite economists out of Stanford and Harvard, and they say what you need is, and this is actually happening, you need a $50 a ton coal tax, carbon tax on carbon, $50 per ton. And so you process that into, you know, you do the calculation to figure out what that means for gasoline and electricity and all that. And so you're now charging $50 a ton for carbon to get there. What if the economists are wrong, right? And it turns out you needed a $100 per ton tax to get a 5%. So what you might have is you do $50 a ton, and that is the predicted effect of that is a 5% reduction. Maybe, so what you do is actually what they told you is it's $40 a ton will get you a 5% reduction. So you do $50 a ton because you want to make sure you get the 5%. So your expectation is it'll get 6%, but you might, you know, fall off a little and only get 5%. But what if it ends up only producing a 2% reduction? Because everybody starts buying SUVs and the stock market goes up again and everybody's feeling rich, and so they don't care how much gasoline costs, right? So you only get a 2% reduction. You kind of violate by accident, right? You wanted to comply and you just didn't get it right, right? You pulled the right lever because you wanted to comply and you just didn't pull it far enough or whatever. So inadvertence. So now let's talk about, so if you have sort of several ways, you know, independent and interdependent self-interest that are explanations of why nations comply, and then intention, incapacity, and inadvertence as reasons they violate, then how do we go about getting states that are violating or that are likely to violate in prospect, that we expect to violate? How do we set up the rules, and how do we implement and enforce or manage compliance so that states don't violate? And without just reading through the notes for today, kind of what's the first thing we should do? We got a treaty, we got to set up a set of rules. What should we do? How should we implement them? We set a new set of rules that says you have to, let's say reduce CO2 emissions by 5% from 1990 levels by the year 2010. How should we implement it?
There's some clear form of information, a way of getting information from the nations to a secretary or something.
Okay, so we need information. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of make, let's set up some information. Is information, like how will information work to get me to comply? 'Cause I want to stay at this level of how do you get, I'm a country out there, and you want to make, you know, and you other countries want to make me comply. How do you do it? I mean, information may be part of the system. We need to know what I'm doing in order to kind of affect it. So that may, but but are you talking about that being a necessary condition or something that actually you use to make me comply?
Necessary condition.
Okay, so we might have some necessary conditions as well as some sort of specific processes. But what are some, so I'm out there violating. How do you make me comply?
You have an incentive to comply.
And how are you going to create that incentive for me, Miranda?
Well, if it's, say, a developing country, maybe there needs to be some kind of like money incentive.
Okay, so one is we can provide rewards, right? Some financial rewards. Okay, so remuneration, right? Rewards. How do rewards work? They increase the benefits of compliance, right? Right? Isn't that all you're doing with a reward? You say, if you comply, you do better than you would than you would otherwise have done, right? We say there's some consequences to compliance and violation, and we want to shift those. If I'm violating, you know that the benefits to me of violation are more than the costs, right? And so all we do is increase the benefits of compliance. We have to increase them enough to make up for the differential between compliance and violation, right? OK, so what else? Megan?
Sanctions.
Sanctions, right? The flip side of this. A punitive approach. Sanctions. So how do those work, Megan?
Increase the cost of violation.
Right, increase the cost of violation. This is our standard one. This is what Miranda, Mark, and others were saying is this is enforcement, right? This is what we think of as enforcement, this punitive approach. Increase the cost of violation. Both of these, notice that both of these are kind of addressing consequences. What else? What are other options? Sarah.
Well, I guess, it depends on what kind of violation it is. If it's a violation that they're not overtly, like with the whaling thing, if they're illegally catching whales, then they need the international monitoring system. Like, is that something that you can do to stop violation?
Like, I'm not following the logic of the argument.
Well, I'm just saying that if it's a kind of someone's violating you, but we're not supposed to necessarily know that they're violating. How would we?
Oh, okay. Well, that's. I think that's sort of what Kari was getting at. We need information. We need just the knowledge, but that both of these are contingent on having. Right. Notice how these depend on good information, right? Because to increase the cost to make either of these work, I have to only punish violators and only reward compliers, right?
I'm just saying then, I guess, to stop violation, we could increase our monitoring power.
Okay, yeah, sure. But it would still, and then once you know, what would you do with it?
Information that we know.
What?
Oh.
Then you still have to kick in one of these, right?
Okay, but that seems like enforcement on either.
Right, but that's what you're saying, right? The information is going to feed a process which either punishes violators.
Well, but I'm saying that maybe if they know that there's going to be international international monitoring,
right.
Then they would have more.
But why do they do that? Think through the logic of that. To avoid, they have to believe, they won't do anything if they believe, yeah, so what? You know I'm cheating, so who cares? Right? The explanation of a lot of human rights behavior is we know what's happening and they don't care, right? Because nothing's going to happen, right? Nobody's going to beat us up for doing it or reward us for not doing it. So you have the information in the system, but I think it's important to notice that information has to feed both of these. They're both dependent on information. What is one thing that's different about these between sanctions and rewards? Think about information. Which one's easier to get information out of?
Reward.
Why, Mark?
Because people want to, if they're trying to get the benefits of compliance, they're going to be more willing to provide you with their information.
They'll be more willing, and in fact, I can set up the structure so I say, hey, I'm happy to give you a reward. You just have to prove to me, to my satisfaction, that you're complying first. Whereas the other way around, it's like, no, I have to prove to you and to everybody else in the room that you're violating before I can feel that it's legitimate to punish you, right? Kari?
Sort of like public opinion in there, or couldn't that be some sort of way to get a violator to comply, like publicize their violation so much that it becomes almost an embarrassment? It sounds like it would work more for like an actual industry, but couldn't it work on the national level as well?
Yeah, I certainly believe that those are still punitive sanctions. They're just a different sort. It was this, we think of sanctions as economic and financial and direct or military or something, but all you're saying is there's a different kind of social sanction, but it's still, you're increasing the cost of violation. The cost is just a social one in your view, but it's still kind of, the logic of it is the same, that you make it costly to me in whatever things I value to violate this agreement. And I don't see conceptually any difference between that kind of cost and other kinds of costs. Mirinda.
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay.
Peer pressure.
Yeah, right. And so those are other ways, but they're still, you're affecting the consequences, right? You're trying to make it more costly to do this. Megan.
Well, and in that case, the only reason companies actually care about public opinion is because they're afraid that people won't buy as many products from them.
Right.
So it's still an economic consideration.
Okay. Okay. Good. So so it can work both ways. What are some other things? I mean, what are some, Mark?
Try and change some of the norms out there.
Okay. So we can change norms.
May have to come through consequences first, but over time, through education or just constant publicity, that people's ideas about certain environmental issues will change.
Yeah. So if we think about what do we really want to do, what we want to do is not have that. If you think about, let's say there was just I just got the new Outside magazine, and there's a short little piece on the tree Luna, that was cut by these loggers. I mean, you want a rule that says don't go cutting wonderful redwoods, except the ones you're allowed to. But in addition, it would be a hell of a lot better if everybody was an environmentalist and didn't get a real thrill out of cutting a big, putting a big chainsaw through a big redwood tree, right? So, I mean, to the extent that everybody's an environmentalist, you don't have to worry about this anymore, right? To the extent people care about the environment and want to protect it, go back to the deep ecology. This is just the eco-philosophical perspective I talked about earlier, right? Change the way people consider the human relationship to the environment, and all of a sudden you don't need rules. How we do it, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question about can you change values without some of these, through any, the process we kind of think of is I beat you up long enough until you internalize, right? I mean, in most religious things, without beating up on people who are religious, but it's called guilt, right? we initiate this guilt process through an external process in which our parents infuse guilt into us. And then, as adults, we get therapy to work out the fact that it's all internalized now, right? And we beat ourselves up, to avoid these problems, right? But that's that process of internalizing a norm and saying, no, I'm not killing somebody because I might get caught. I'm not killing somebody because I believe it's not done. And at the extreme, it's I don't even consider it. In a way, it almost excludes options, right? Like when I get really mad at somebody, killing them is not an option. Not because I couldn't, but rather because it's not just morally not an option. Megan.
Couldn't you also just work on making the alternatives more attractive? So that if you find an alternative to whatever they're doing that is suddenly more attractive than whatever they were doing before, they're going to comply by default. Yeah.
So you have what I've again, this is laying out a kind of the major theoretical structure for what I'm working on. Is a generative strategy. You just sort of create new opportunities. If you want, I mean, if these are sticks, right? These are carrots. These are perhaps sermons, right? We just go preach at people. You should be an environmentalist, right? These are, the best I can come up for is, it's a field of dreams, right? If you build it, they will come, right? If you go out and create this alternative, they will use it. I mean, and a good example of this is, again, I keep using the oil pollution case because it's a case I know well, but in there, they set up a process in Europe. They wanted to improve enforcement. So you have a bunch of little ports all over Europe. Each of them has 5 inspectors, each of whom can do 4 inspections a day of a ship coming in. So they got 20 inspections, right? Unfortunately, they got 100 ships coming in every day. So the question is how do you get them to do good inspections? Well, all they did was they set up a big database in Saint-Malo, France, and they said, every day you inspect, just send us a telex, a fax, and I'm sure they do it by email now, a report on your inspection, And so after a little bit of time, you had a database of all the ships going around, and better yet, once you had the data from yesterday in the last month, as soon as you see 100 ships coming in the morning, you type in all 100 ships. And you say, what are the inspection reports for all these? And you rank them. And you say, hey, this one has not had a violation for the past 4 years in any port in Europe. It's been inspected 20 times and never a problem. This other one has been inspected 20 times, and it's had a problem every damn time. I'm inspecting that one, right? And another one that we haven't isn't even in the database yet, and you definitely inspect that one to get it in the database, right? And they didn't have to do much. They didn't have to create incentives where every time you use the database to, that you'll get extra money or something. It was just, hey, now I can deploy my resources more effectively. So you generated a new option by just having this database that they contributed information to. They created themselves, but it provided something back, right? So you create new opportunities for states to do things, right? And then, the other way to think of this is, go out and develop, you got $1 million, you can use it for enforcement, or you can use it to create a new alternative, right? Spend $1 billion, create cheap photovoltaic that's worth 1 cent a kilowatt hour, and hand it out free. And all of a sudden you have a new alternative that's more attractive, right? Okay. Others. Well, one is the opposite of this, right? Preclusive strategies. Or locks, right? Just remove opportunities. Okay, so in a sense, this is all dealing with opportunities. Removing removing opportunities can be like, it really became impossible to buy a tanker that didn't have certain pollution control equipment on board after a while, right? You just remove it wasn't that they were going to get caught and punished. It was that you couldn't buy the ship with the wrong equipment on board. When you went to a shipbuilder, the shipbuilder just would not sell you the boat the wrong way. Why? Because once the rule said you have to be built in a certain way, and the shipbuilder realized that if they built them that way, it was $100,000 more, and they got 10% on that by adding that equipment, right? So they got their 10% profit on that extra $100,000 of equipment, so it's worth $10,000. They have no incentive to sell you a ship that's not legal, right? And so you can't actually go get a ship that's illegal now anymore. And the last one is, if you say in these carrots and sticks, we change the consequences. In preclusive and generative, we change the opportunities for, this is remove the opportunities for bad behaviors and create opportunities for good behaviors. Right, and again, one other way to think about this is think about any cases where we provide funding to countries, right? To say, you can't do this because you're too poor, but if we give you this money, you'll be able to do it, right? This goes to these questions of, this says compliance is a function of intention. This says it's a function of capacity, right? This goes to the incapacity-capacity problem here. And the last is information, or what I call cognitive problem. And this is information in a slightly different sense than Kari brought it up. I think the way Kari brought it up is right. But this is sort of labeling, where you say, we're not going to change what happens to you. All we're going to do is make you aware of what will happen. You're unaware. Now one is organic, right? So organic labeling is a cognitive approach that says, hey, you can eat whatever you like, but you should know that these are organic and these aren't. Then that kicks into something like this, which once you have organic labeling, it's a cognitive strategy for the consumers who aren't punished for buying organic, or in fact, you're punished for buying organic, right? Because the price is higher for organic, right? But people choose it, and through that process of choice, they punish brown producers and they reward green producers. Diana.
It just seems to me that the preclusive strategy, if it achieves the best outcome because you've achieved what is the goal stated or otherwise of any environmental treaty out there, which is self-regulatory, environmentally friendly behavior.
Right, it is, but it's not always available. It's just not always easy to do that. Yes, I think in a lot of cases it's helpful to have preclusive strategies, but it's just not always possible. How do we preclude people from emitting CO2? We can't do it, right? Because we can't even, it's not even like in shipping where there's only about 10 ship manufacturers in the world, or 20 or whatever, right? Every country creates its own power plants. So we can't preclude them producing power plants. We can't produce them from burning coal because most countries have some coal reserves, right? So I think there's a lot of times that it's a better one. It's just not always available. But a case where cognitive worked was actually, if you look at the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Treaty, what it did was essentially get Germany complied with that, not because they were worried about any sanctions or rewards or anything else. through the scientific process that was part of LURTAP, they learned that their own pollution was harming, was fouling their own nest. They were largely responsible for the die-off of the forest in Germany. The Germans themselves. Part of it was coming from other countries, but a significant part was coming from themselves, right? And they realized, hey, we can help ourselves just by stopping our own pollutant. So there's this sort of information, increase information about consequences without changing those consequences, right? That they didn't get punished for polluting, and they didn't get rewarded for not polluting. They just all of a sudden realized that the costs and benefits of pollution were different than they had thought. So this is where, information and science can make a big difference. The point I want to leave you with is simply that this is where all the action seems to be. Or that is, this is where everybody thinks all the action is in carrots and sticks. Yeah, who's this? This is the lawyers, right? Get the right rules and beat them up, have a lot of cops on the beat. These are the economists, right, who say, just let the market work. But there's a lot of other stuff going on. And I think you want to kind of be attentive to the different ways we can kind of attack the problem of how do we get implementation. And what I'm working on, and I would welcome any of you doing your papers on it, is which of these works best and under what circumstances. That if you've got 6 options here, which works best, or maybe some combination of them works best. Maybe you like things that combine the two. But that's the kinds of questions I want you to be thinking about.